Hello everybody, welcome, good evening. Nice of you to show up, or that you all are here at the Accursed Creator event organized by FOTODOK and IMPAKT. My name is Rob Wetzer. I am curator of the current exhibition at FOTODOK. It's called Reinventing Nature, which explores renewed relationships with nature and technology in a time that technology transforms nature as we know it. And it does it through photography mainly, but also virtual reality, a bit of film. This evening is part of that exhibition as an extension, exploring more the relation between technology and the human body and the different levels of how we shape our own body and biology. Ion De Wind, director of IMPAKT, will explain a little bit on IMPAKT's involvement in this evening, in this event, and why they are here. I'd like to thank a few people before we start. Jan van Troost and Proost, the caterer, also the Utrecht Archive, our host for tonight. And need to be complete, I want to be complete, a few funds, Fonds 21, Ventenen van Vlissingen and de Mondriaan for generously supporting not only this evening but also the exhibition, making it possible. I'm going to leave it at that. One more thing to say, the exhibition runs until April 23rd, and on your seat there is a flyer but also a ticket. If you haven't seen the exhibition, the ticket grants you access for a second visitor for free. So either you've been there and you want to bring your mom to see it again, or you haven't seen it and after this evening you really want to see it, and then come and bring your mom still, or a friend or somebody else. Come visit us, it's there until September 23rd. I'm going to give the mic to Ion, and he'll introduce himself and the IMPAKT.
Yeah, thanks Rob, thanks. My name is Ion, and before I forget, I also would like to extend a few thanks. Our sponsors, de gemeente Utrecht and Stimuleringsfonds Creatieve Industrie. And of course for co-producing together with FOTODOK the event, the IMPAKT team. Without them, there would be no event. Tonight is all about the changing relationship between nature and technology. Technological advancements have enabled man to improve quality of life. At the same time, many warn for risks and points towards possible negative consequences. We seem to be able to do a lot. At the same time, we often have no power over nature at all. Steve Kurtz was supposed to be here tonight. He didn't make it to Utrecht because of stormy weather in the US. That's 1-0 for nature. So I think we can all agree that we should not get presumptuous. We're very sad that Steve Kurtz is not here, but also very happy to have a Dutch artist to replace him, and that's Jeroen van Loon, and he will be more introduced by Natalie and Tobias later on. And preparing this event about biohacking, I also had to think about the next step, maybe the next step, which is geohacking. On Dutch radio and on The Guardian it was reported that the world's biggest solar geoengineering research program may get a dangerous boost from Donald Trump. Under the Trump administration, enthusiasm appears to be growing for the controversial technology of solar engineering, which aims to spray sulfate particles into the atmosphere to reflect the sun's radiation back to space and decrease the temperature of Earth. Will we be able to control the climate, or is this the opening of another Pandora's box? Telling truth from fiction is sometimes hard when it comes to the narrative surrounding technologies. How metaphors related to the supernatural, the magic and myths are used in these technological narratives is the subject of the upcoming IMPAKT Festival. The festival is appropriately titled Haunted Machines and Wicked Problems, and the IMPAKT Festival will be organized from the 25th to the 29th of October. Main venues will be at Huis Utrecht, I should say, and the gallery spaces of FOTODOK and Casco's. More details are on our website. Please subscribe to our newsletter and like us on Facebook. We're very happy to work with FOTODOK for the upcoming festival, but also we're very happy to co-organize this event with you. The curators of the IMPAKT Festival 2017 are Natalie Kane and Tobias Ravel. They are here and will be your moderators for tonight. few words on Natalie and Tobias. Natalie Kane is a new media arts curator, writer and researcher whose work explores the intersection of art, design, futures and technology. She's curator at Future Everything, a digital culture lab in Manchester and annual art and technology festival. Tobias Ravel is a senior lecturer at University of the Arts in London and a founding member of research consultancy Strange Telemetry. He's also a digital artist and has been commissioned by and exhibiting at a range of European galleries and festivals. Natalie and Tobias will introduce the guests of this evening. Please a warm applause for Natalie Kane and Tobias Ravel.
Hello, thank you all for coming. It's fantastic. Oh, yes, this is easier.
I'm much shorter than Tobias, so it'd be difficult for him to crane over.
Yes, so when we were talking to Rob last year about the theme of the exhibition, Reinventing Nature, which is absolutely fantastic, some really stunning work in it. One thing that came readily apparent from the theme we were working with was this idea of the monstrous. In the idea of reinventing nature, an easy parallel to draw is with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a novel that will be 200 years old next year. And so we named this event Accursed Creator, because we wanted to think about whether the Frankensteinian myth of man's intervention with nature having a monstrous outcome still applies today. What is the role and the relationship between man and technology and nature? Are those, in fact, terms that we need to reassess and reestablish? And so to help us with that conversation, we have two artists and a philosopher. Jeroen van Loon, who's stepped into the last minute for Steve Kurtz, fantastic work that he does, he's going to talk about a bit. Aggie Haynes from the UK, another sort of designer, speculative designer and artist, working with what a human means in the world of biohacking and bodily change. And then René ten Bos, the national philosopher, who will be talking a bit about his work with the Anthropocene, the idea of a human-centric world, a world that has been generated and shaped by humans, arguably since the beginning of agriculture, I suppose. So Natalie and I now, or Natalie mostly, are going to introduce some projects and some ideas that we've been bouncing around and framing this discussion as a way of opening up the type of thing we're going to think about. Each of our guests will then do a presentation of their own work and interests and contextualization. And then we've got time for a discussion and a Q&A at the end where we've got some questions of our own, but also really invite you to think of some questions of your own. This is quite an intimate and personal venue, so there's a real opportunity for a great discussion to take place. So, Natalie, what have you got for us?
Tobias, it's a good question. So I think we wanted to kind of introduce just a very short sort of contextualization of what we were thinking about when it comes to the monstrous and biohacking and bioart. And when we were kind of looking at this event, there's a passage from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that Tobias mentioned, that basically is a letter that Frankenstein's monster writes to Frankenstein, and he just is horrible to him because he's appalled by how his existence is in the world, because this person thought it right to give him life. So it's quite an interesting quote that we drew the title of today's event from. So we're just going to kind of give a few projects that are thinking about this in different ways. So the first is Burton Neater's Republic of Salivation, I keep getting that wrong, Salivation, which kind of looks at the idea of sort of food shortages and famine that we might possibly face in the future. So in this particular sort of speculative scenario, governments are forced to essentially ration food into sort of starch packets, and this all depends on your employment and your employment status. And part of the story is based that Burton Neater kind of construct is around the idea of people essentially hacking those starch packets to create alcohol using saliva and this person's saliva. There's quite an interesting kind of controversy that surrounded this piece as well, which I'm going to just hand over to Tobias quickly because he knows much more about it.
Yeah, one of the reasons we wanted to highlight this project was that within the kind of speculative art and design community, it kicked off a real debate about what the right of artists and designers was to play with ideas such as food shortages and the changes we have to make that are very real for a lot of people in the world. Burton Neater are London-based artists who don't necessarily suffer food shortages every day, but they were speculating about a scenario which for some people in the world is really very real. And one of the things we want to bring up in this event is then what is the role of artists and designers in thinking and talking about this stuff when we live in such radically different types of societies and cultures with different resources.
Yeah, so what do these kind of provocations do to us re-examining and reassessing our own position in society? So I mean, this is one example of a project, and the next one that I wanted to show was Graham, who was an interesting publication by a sort of team of a trauma surgeon, an artist, and a crash expert to imagine what the human body would need to look like to withstand car crashes. So it was very much a provocation about the idea of how a person might evolve to look with the kind of consistently changing and very amplified technological environment. And Graham, as you can imagine, looks quite monstrous. I mean, he's an unfortunate looking guy. I mean, on the right-hand side, kind of, it shows the fact that his legs and all of his joints are ambidextrous, essentially. They can move at any point, probably is the wrong word for it, but they can spring to action at any point. His body is designed so that he has thicker skin to withstand lacerations. He has no neck, so that his back can't break. Yeah, he's a generally unfortunate looking guy, but I don't know, he might be, in a near future where there's a possibility, he might be like the, I don't know, George Clooney of potential crash victims. But yeah, so this is an idea kind of showing a provocation that makes us reassess our own relationship with our body, because obviously we see ourselves as being strong in some instances, but incredibly fragile and sort of collapsible when it comes to something like the advent of technology. And obviously there's a lot of other ways that you can think about the human when it comes to that as well. And then we have Steve Kurtz, who sadly can't be with us today because of, I think he blamed it on climate change, didn't he? It was climate change that stopped his plane from coming, which is a fair assumption. I mean, it needs to get back at some time. And this is his project Free Range Grain, which looked at the idea of genetic modification with food. So they set up a lab basically and allow people to bring their food that they suspected might be genetically modified to their lab, and within 72 hours they would assess it, they'd figure out what the kind of genus of it was, and they would tell you what the kind of potential possibility of it being a genetically modified foodstuff did. And obviously it's a very formalised lab environment, and we all kind of recognise this in terms of verifiability and scientific fact. But the kind of wider conversation around this was to kind of ask us to think what we meant by genetic modification and what we might think it might look like, and actually how far are we okay with it being, and actually if you told you this food is genetically modified, what does your relationship to all other food that is like it look like? And then you have Floris Koek, who is a Netherlands-based artist, and his sort of film and project, The Modular Body, looked at the idea of Oscar, who was a living organism that was built from human cells. His sort of fictional, science fiction-based film, and his fictional inventor was Cornelius Lassmann, who was kind of described as a versatile and innovative biologist, which is an interesting way to describe biologists, because generally I think that they are all quite innovative in some ways. So basically they kind of created a film to explore the different stages and different points that led to the creation and essentially testing and all sorts of things. And I didn't actually include the video of this slightly monstrous, horrible organism, but the two legs walk, but in a really unnatural way.
But the video is at FOTODOK.
Yeah, the video is at FOTODOK. You can go and see it upstairs, but I really recommend going and see it. There's so many interesting, weird facets to it that I can't even begin to explore properly. Too loud. And this is from the 2014 sort of sketches that Floris did.
Good.
So it's very malleable, and looking at the idea of human organisms as cells and malleable material, and something that can kind of stretch and change and convert in different ways. And it all becomes quite squeamish and quite. It makes you think about things in terms of, oh, so if this is to be done to my body, how will I feel about it? Because we're currently now in this sort of period of scientific progress, that we have things like CRISPR, which, although this CRISPR sequences were first observed nearly about 30 years ago, I think, the actual sort of CRISPR Cas9 process, as it's kind of known as, has only been around for about 2 years. And actually, I kind of read today that in the last week they did the first ever actual physical human editing of a person who had lung cancer. And it's one of those things that we're now living with today, the idea of what does removing or changing or making different the parts of our body that we previously saw as quite inaccessible, quite predetermined. So I was quite interested in looking about what that might look like, and actually what futures that might look like, and also to which point do we say stop, to which point we understand we've reached a certain point, all of those kind of applications. Yeah. So, I'm going to welcome our next speaker. I'm just going to get my very good queuing device. So, Jerome Van Loon, who was very kindly stepped in at the last minute, he received a Bachelor in Digital Media Design at the HAKU and is a Master of European Media Master of the Arts. His work focuses on documenting and revealing digital culture, online and offline, and he's given a TEDx talk in 2012 and 14, and was nominated for the Designers and Artists for Genomics Award in 2012, won the European Youth Award, and was awarded the KF Heinel Art Grant in 2014, which is a very impressive resume. So, if you could please welcome to the stage Jerome Van Loon.
Okay, thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk about a single project which is called sellout.me, a project in which I offered my DNA data for sale for 1 year online, so everybody could place a bid through the website sellout.me, and the point was to sell my own DNA data and figure out how much I am worth. And the following clip I'm going to show you shows you the last, I think, 30 seconds of this year-long project. So you will see the final part of me getting the bids through my smartphone and selling my DNA data.
Is het 12 uur?
Yeah. So I think my video camera symbolically stopped working exactly on 12 o'clock because the footage there is no more footage, it just stops. The battery was empty when I sold my DNA data. The project looks like this. It's a server cabinet which you see in various data houses from Facebook to Google and to anywhere. It consists of a photo series and some few letters I will talk about in a minute. In the screen below, you'll see this data running, which is my actual DNA data. You see the first column is the chromosome 1, then you see the position, and then you see the actual A, T, C, and G, which make up my DNA data. And if you, at this rate, stand in front of the server cabinet for 17 years, then eventually you will have seen my entire DNA sequence once. On the top screen you'll see the website in real time, in which you can see the actual bids taking place. So it started at €0, and at the end I will show you for how much my DNA data has been sold. The starting point of this work was actually a quote from Nelly Cruz a few years ago, in which she argues, in short, ladies and gentlemen, my message today is that data is gold, and I argued for myself that if data is a new gold, then what is my own big data worth? For how much could I sell my own private DNA data? To do that, I had to take a few steps. I went to the Erasmus MC in Rotterdam. There they took some of my blood. Eventually, from the blood, with some complicated scientific steps, I'm not sure how to explain them. If I'm being very honest, from the blood they take the biological DNA, only the DNA. The DNA goes on a small glass plate, and the plate goes into a machine which is called the HiStack 2000, and then the machine runs for 2 weeks straight, and then eventually it generates a copy of my biological DNA, which becomes digital DNA, of course. The final steps were storing it in the server park from Erasmus MC, and eventually the last step was to, and this is the big screenshot from the FTP software, in which I transfer the data from the server house from Erasmus MC back to the server cabinet in the museum. And that was the end of the transfer. There were a few things that were quite important to me when I wanted to sell it, and they came more or less as a shock to me, because I thought, it's a nice project, I'm going to sell my DNA, it might be interested, how much is my DNA worth, who would actually want to buy my DNA. But during the whole process of making the work, there were two main questions that kind of bugged me. One was, what if nothing happens? Nobody sees the website, and on the final day some person offers €1 and buys the whole artwork. I must say that when you place an offer on this artwork, you'll get the whole artwork, meaning you'll get the whole server cabinet, all the hardware, the website domain, the photographs, the letters, and of course the DNA data. So I was not quite happy with the thought that somebody would buy it for €1, which made me think maybe I should start with a higher starting price, maybe the production price, or maybe some other price, in order to make sure that not somebody with €1 or €5 could buy the artwork. That was the first problem I encountered. The second problem was what would happen, or what could happen if somebody will buy my DNA. Because of course it's not only my DNA. That's the most interesting part of DNA data, where it's quite different from Facebook data or social media data or credit card information. That when I'm selling my DNA data, it's also the DNA data of my son, for example, or my sister, or my parents, or my grandparents. So when I decided to sell this data, you could argue that I'm not even in my right to sell this data, because who is the owner of this DNA data? Am I the owner? Do I have to get confirmation from my sister, or my parents may be the owner, because they created my data, you could say. Because all these ethical questions came around, I decided to ask 4 companies to write me a letter in which they would write about their perspective on this artwork. Because I'm merely the artist initiating the project, and I need some kind of discourse, some kind of context surrounding the artwork in order to make it function, to let it have some impact. So I asked Christie's, Erasmus MC, KPMG and Fox IT, so an art company, an ethical company, a big data company, and a cybercrime company. And these letters are freely available from the website, and I want to show a few quotes from these letters. The first is from the ethical point of view, Elena Bunnik, who writes, "How does one express the moral value of DNA? Can it be converted to a monetary unit? Could we possibly conceive of something like a moral selling price in relation to the cost price?" Which is the first problem I just told you. I wanted to raise the starting price, but somebody told me, yeah, you're kind of being a wuss right now, because you're trying to sell your DNA data, and now you're already talking about a starting price. If you really want to sell your DNA data and know what DNA data is worth, then you should start at €0. Maybe DNA data is worth less than the production price. Sander Klaus and Nout Wieler from KPMG write, "Jeroen's DNA profile has no monetary value at this moment. It will only be valuable if Jeroen finds a way to get another 100,000 people, or preferably even more, to offer their DNA profiles for sale. Because they argue that if you have one profile, you cannot relate it to other profiles. So you don't know if I have a special DNA profile or a very average DNA profile." And they go even one step further. They write, if you have a very specific DNA profile, a very unique profile, or a very, very average, then you're bound to be worthless. If you're somewhere in between, then then other companies can make money more easily off your DNA profile. Pim Volkers from Fox IT writes, if this value is not clear at when we sell or hand over our DNA data, we could end up like the farmer who sells his ground for a small profit and then is forced to watch as the gold is mined from those grounds. which is kind of an interesting perspective because DNA data and the stuff we know about DNA data, of course, changes every year. There are more there's more research to be done. So if we know something today about my DNA data, it could be completely different in 5 years or 10 years. So the value of my DNA data is also related to the scientific discoveries. The final perspective is from the art world, from Christie's, who sells, of course, and auctions artworks. And Peter van der Graaf writes, what is the value of Jeroen van Loon's DNA? As I have said before, past results are no guarantee for the future, but if financial value can be attributed to Manzoni's excrements, Pierre Manzoni sold his own feces, his scanned feces, as a work of art because he believed everything he made was an artwork. He was kind of right because after his death, these scanned feces were sold, I think, for $200,000 a piece. At what price will Jeroen van Loon in his entirety sell? So now, of course, I've built a lot of suspension on how much my DNA data is worth. And this is the final screenshot of the bidding, the last minute, where you can see that for 1,100 euros, the artwork has been bought by the Verbeek Foundation in Belgium. And if you want to see if you want to see my DNA data being owned by somebody else, you can go to the Verbeek Foundation in Belgium and see my DNA data. And this is my father who stands before some of his own DNA data being owned by somebody else. And that was the end of my project, my presentation.
So up next we have Aggie Hayes, and her work is focused on the design of the human body. How might people respond to the possibilities of our body as another everyday material, and how far can we push our malleable bodies while still being accepted by society? So Aggie Hayes, if you'd like to come to the stage.
Hello, I'm going to be running through a lot of different ideas quite quickly and then talk to you really briefly about a few different projects of mine that sort of relate to this idea of haunted machines and particularly Frankenstein. So I'm from a design background, I'm also a researcher, and I look at how our idea of the fabric of the body is affected by nascent biomedical and healthcare technologies. So I'm going to start with this painting by Joseph Wright. It shows this experiment that used to be used for entertainment, and what they used to do was put a bird in a jar and then slowly remove the air, and the audience would decide whether the bird would live or die. And it's kind of sad because the bird's fate is sort of decided instead of by people's scientific inquisitiveness sort of took over, and they would decide to kill the bird most of the time. And even though these people look quite disturbed by it, the power of having this power over life must have had this really incredible potency for people to sort of make this decision. And this piece of work was really, really criticised because it looks like a religious painting, and at the time that was quite controversial. But actually, I think that Wright's decision to make this sort of decision look really godly wasn't a mistake, and he sort of shares that idea with Mary Shelley, who she writes in Frankenstein, one of my favourite quotes. She writes, "I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretch out, and then on the working of some powerful engines show signs of life and stir with an uneasy half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavour to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world." And she wrote this when she was 19, which is really crazy, but also it really still resonates today in conversations like this about sort of the ethical and moral decision making that happens when we're thinking about our scientific research. This sort of exhibiting the boundaries of life and death was quite a popular thing in entertainment, and I'm not sure if a lot of you know, but in places like Coney Island, they had a sort of sideshow where they would show incubators, and these sort of things got pushed into scientific research, so they're almost like preemptive in a way of people then wanting to spend money on this sort of research. So I found it really fascinating how the entertainment industry and medical entertainment has sort of formulated some of these ideas. And one of my favourite medical entertainers is Robert Liston. He was an advocate of a particular medical technology, and he was really strong. He was the quickest person to ever amputate a leg. He could do it in 28 seconds, which is amazing because now it takes a few hours. So he could hold the artery of the leg and chop it off really quickly, and in fact so quickly that he would occasionally take off the fingers of some of his medical students who would be holding the leg, which is quite scary. But he would do things like he would shout to his audience when he was amputating legs to try and encourage them to get involved. And I've got a really interesting quote, but maybe I'll tell you it afterwards. This was kind of really shocking at the time because hypnotism and mesmerism was really the way to put people to sleep. That was accepted. And then what happened was the Yankee Dodge came around, which is essentially what we call anesthesia, and he was sort of the person through this entertainment, this way of encouraging the audience to sort of get involved in the entertainment, was a way of sort of encouraging them to accept anesthesia. Sorry, didn't realise there was going to be music on that. But it's really interesting because for me the story of Frankenstein doesn't only sort of highlight this profound effect between the entertainment industry and scientific communication. So interestingly, the first cinematic representation of Frankenstein was actually made by Thomas Edison, which is sort of really interesting as he was sort of a radical inventor at the time. But of course, Frankenstein also shows the sort of permeability between the organic and the cultural world and the acceptance of such. So it's really interesting to sort of think about how decisions are made with use to these sort of representations, and how these representations might actually dictate what topics, tools and theories are sort of worthy of our scientific efforts. So in the past, the sort of generation of novel biomedical and healthcare research has been sort of dependent on the knowledge gained through sort of simulacrums, so through things like the dead material. And it's kind of, as you can imagine, it's difficult to view the body while it's working, while it's alive. So the ways that people tried to understand the body was through things like pencil on paper, modelling techniques, visual imagery, digital replicas, physical objects, or even sort of model organisms. And the production of these representations doesn't really sort of encourage a transparency of the body as we might think, but as Jose van Dyck says, it actually kind of turns it into this contested cultural object. So although these models still sort of lack the, the motion, the consistency, the behaviour, moisture, smell, I've written a massive list of the real human body, it sort of helps us understand how we could or should act towards the real thing. So through interactions with these sort of simulacrums, we've learnt a lot about medicine, but even though these have sort of come about as a sort of form of a simulated reality, that being in the sort of unhumanness, not the real human form. So in a way, this sort of simulated human could be thought of like Frankenstein, who's sort of an anomaly, Frankenstein's monster, who's sort of an anomaly or a monstrum on the sort of fringes of humanness. So I'm doing some work at the moment with a dental laboratory in Plymouth, and I've had a chance to view a lot of the tools that they have there. And I'm sort of really interested in the fact that these tools do play a really pivotal role in understanding the workings of the body. But it's really important to remember that they're not passive, they have this really active effect. So this is a phantom head that is essentially used by dentists to try and get used to there being a head-shaped object while they're working in the mouth. But also it's used to encourage empathy. And I don't have to tell you that it doesn't. This is terrifying. And it's really interesting to know that gaining this sort of knowledge through scientific representation has this knock-on effect that can cause quite big problems with dentistry, for example, because it doesn't formulate empathy, some of the dental students will do things like leave tools on people's faces by accident as a result of getting used to dealing with a plastic head. So it's kind of impossible to create imagery that's void of this network of sort of mental connections. But if we could make simulations which do make these emotional connections like these sort of ones do, I think this is quite an interesting space for designers to sort of make an intervention, people who've sort of been trained to understand the sort of communicative and have a sensibility to sort of visualization. So with the onset of new technologies and potentially body modifying technologies, it's interesting to think where's the line between us and the things that we put inside us, particularly when they look so realistic. And this can sort of redefine things like prosthetics. So for example, a targeted drug might attach itself permanently to a cell in no less of a sufficient way to, say, an artificial limb. And some of my most favourite modifications are Rob Spence, for example, who has an eye that can also film things. Jerry Javala, he's got a prosthetic finger that's got a USB stick in it. Victoria Modista and her sort of pointed leg prosthetic. But our bodies themselves are already sort of capable of regrowth and regeneration, seen through these amazing rhinoplasty techniques. And we sort of can borrow things from other areas of the body almost as sculptural material. So Harold Gillies was quite famous for doing this. He used to cut up areas of the body, fold it over, let the area heal underneath, cut it off, and then essentially that could be utilised as modelling clay to build up other areas of the face. And then if you start to think of the body as this manoeuvrable and modifiable material, you start to think, how surgical procedures have developed to view the body as something that could potentially be pervious to design. So this is a video that I often show. It's an image of maxillofacial surgery, and I really love it because, again, it looks so simplified. At the end, they sort of put a few screws in and shift the face about. And it looks really cleanly, but completely doesn't show the experience of the patient or the practitioner in sort of making these sort of interesting things. Yeah, so it's just sort of shift it around, and then you've got a completely different face shape. So this has sort of formulated a lot of my interests up to now. And I was sort of interested in bone and how I might move around my own face in order to create new sort of how the form might essentially affect my function. So the prosthetic that you just saw was to make myself better at sports, essentially. But when going back in history and seeing how people have modified bodies in the past, often this has happened through things like modification of children. And if you think about this from a parental point of view, it kind of makes sense if you want your child to fit comfortably within the bounds of social norms. But it also makes sense from a material perspective, because this is when you're at your most malleable. So to quickly go through a couple of projects, I decided, utilising this sort of information, that I might make a series of sculptures of babies that all had sort of modifications that would be implemented by parents to benefit the child later in life. And they're all based on procedures that are in existence now. So these might, for example, exist in a world where the ethics were different, where these things were sort of acceptable. So this baby has a more ridge-shaped nose, it might live better at higher altitudes. This baby has a higher head surface area to dissipate heat in the wake of global warming. This baby has a toe missing, it might contract something like hookworm, which can diminish allergies. So if it suffered from asthma in a world that's getting more polluted, maybe that would be helpful for your baby. A baby with larger cheeks to absorb more caffeine and work for longer hours and earn lots of money. A baby with a new orifice in a low fatty area to absorb more caffeine. To absorb more drugs over a longer period of time if you suffer from something like diabetes. So in a way, I suppose what I'm interested in is this sort of the agency of these kinds of technologies and where they come from. So this was a project that I did at the same time, 2013, which looked again at me imagining myself as Frankenstein, utilising new technologies such as bioprinting. So this was a speculative operation that imagined this organ, which is essentially a biological defibrillator, that has these pouches of cells from an electric eel that could essentially shock your heart back into its normal beating pattern if you were to have a heart attack or if you were prone to have a heart attack. This organ is for people who might be prone to suffering a stroke and can produce hiridin in order to sort of act as an anticoagulant. This organ is for people who suffer from cystic fibrosis, so if you had something like the wall of a rattlesnake that could vibrate really quickly over a long period of time, could you dispel mucus out of the digestive system more quickly? I'm not sure how much time I've got left, but Oh, cool. But it was kind of interesting for me after doing this work to sort of think, well, you know, what are the kind of people who can afford this? What are the kind of people who are actually like connecting to having these kind of procedures done? So I talked to a lot of sort of young mothers who had very different views to me on designer babies, obviously, because I don't have a child. And I sort of became quite interested in producing something that I had more of a connection to myself. So as part of the BioArt and Design Awards, I worked with two neuroscientists at Erasmus, Jos van der Geest and Marcel de Jeu, and we scanned my brain in a MRI scanner, diffusion tensor MRI scanner. And the idea was that we wanted to try and translate my brain data into a machine. So what we did was we sort of put, with the help of a computational neuroscientist, Jack Fletcher, roboticist, a musician, lots of different people, we sort of put 720 nodes across the 3D structure of my brain and translated this data into an updating artificial neural network. So what that meant was, as inputs go into this, the connections in your brain would change, or the model of my brain would change. And this could mean that we could essentially program my brain into something else and see if my brain might change, if it was in a toaster, or in, you know, if you woke up and you were like Beyonce, what would your brain do, or, you know. So we decided to put this in a drone as we thought it might be interesting sort of in the gallery space, having these thoughts, you know, floating around like my thoughts. And this is it in Mood Gallery, and it was quite an interesting sort of thing to try and work out whether the audience perceived its decision-making as somehow indicative of sentience, rather than it, because it had gone through this sort of complex process, or whether they just thought it was just a big balloon. And this sort of has culminated in my research that's going on right now, that I'm writing about as my thesis, but also which came out of a residency at the Varg Society. And the Varg is a really amazing place, particularly regarding the history of medicine. So they still have this anatomical theatre there, and if you haven't been there yet, please go, because it's totally amazing. What they would do is they would execute people in the square outside and bring their bodies into this room and cut them up for science. But they had, it's really interesting because around the wall, it still says that, it still sort of talks about how these criminals would come in and now their bodies sort of have meaning. And so what we would do, we sort of encouraged an audience to come into this sort of quasi-simulation of medical futures in order to sort of question some of the funding that's going into research now. So the exhibition and sort of discussion was sort of cut into 4 parts, or 4 different, that were based on scientific research that is currently being funded. And sort of perhaps to preempt some of the problems that I think we should be simulating about some of that research. So the audience came in as medical students, and they had to cut up my sculptures, which was actually quite disturbing to watch myself. But what they had to do for this one was they had to cut off a cyst that had grown around a bionic eye implant. This one was that they had to remove a sort of disc that collected sort of nanoparticles that might get caught in your lungs and sort of clean it out. This one was that they had to remove a tooth from a teratoma growth in their leg and then implant it into a mouth. This is all made of silicon, by the way, don't worry. And the final one was that they had to dissect a head that had this technique called clarity potentially done to it, which can actually make your cells go slightly transparent. So I'm just going to finish really quickly with an image of Arm Fall Off Boy, which I think is, well, yeah, a really interesting idea in itself. But I think after being asked to come here and think about Frankenstein, I was really interested to think about whether our humanity had been compromised by our sort of sense of identity and essence had been compromised by this sort of biomedical technologies. But I feel like it's actually our sort of innermost desire to alter ourselves which kind of makes us human. So since Frankenstein's been written, I think there's still a fear of science that's kind of maintained. And Shelley writes, none but those who have experienced them can conceive the enticements of science. So perhaps this anxiety doesn't necessarily, it's not perhaps wholly due to scientific research in general, but just how we utilise knowledge. Just because we've learnt something, it doesn't necessarily invoke the use of it, basically. So for hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, we've barely even sort of tapped into the vastness of human potential, and it seems that the opportunity of introducing sort of new material through biotechnologies opens up the gates for sort of endless possibility. But, and sorry to keep with the comic theme, with great power comes great responsibility. I think more thought sort of needs to be put into material that we have such a strong biological connection with. So perhaps with the introduction of new products, they shouldn't necessarily just be judged on form and price, but rather our relationship to the product, especially if there's a chance that the product might become us. So, I think a lot of people have said the next step is to sort of just try this stuff. After all, as Sargent says, technological innovation is part and parcel of that development of exploring humanity and exploring the world around us. So our new designs for life may then just sort of become the next step in our own evolution. It's no longer a sort of question of technological possibility, but rather perhaps one of human character that might push us forward into sort of this new age of biotechnology. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. I guess I wasn't the only one who was kind of going, ooh. Lots of very hyper-real, interesting objects, things, people, parts of people. So finally, we have Orani ten Bos, who was recently named, I apologise for my pronunciation, Denke des Federlands. No, not even close, that's fine. I've learned this from being here for 3 weeks. National philosopher, winner of the Socrates Cup in 2016, and writer of the book Wandering in the Anthropocene. And to let him explain what that means, I welcome Rani to the stage.
Good evening. Wandering in the Anthropocene, astray in the Anthropocene. I don't know exactly what I should be doing here, because Rob, who organized this theme about a cursed creator, asked me 2 things. I should reflect on what has been going on here before. How many slides did we see? 125? That is something that I cannot mull over. No opportunities whatsoever. And he asked me to talk a little bit about the Anthropocene, because I wrote this little book on the Anthropocene, and the relationship between the Anthropocene on the one hand and the theme of this evening, the accursed creator, is of course that Anthropocene has transmogrified nature to such an extent that the human being, or humanity in general, has been accused of changing nature somehow. There's a lot of debate about this. Is it humanity? Can you accuse humanity as such? Or can you, should you not accuse humanity, but should you accuse parts of humanity? Feminists, for example, would argue it's not humanity as such, it are men who did this, and they claim that the Anthropocene should be called the Androcene. Andros is Greek for man, anthropos is of course human being. Other people say it are neither men nor women, but it are the capitalists, so they argue it should be the Capitalocene. And there are many people, others say it are the obese people who should be blamed, and they talk about the phagocene. Phagocene, phagain means eating too much. So there are many discussions about whether the Anthropocene is right. a lot of my colleagues in academia argue that the Anthropocene is an arrogant term. It betrays a certain kind of human hybris and that we shouldn't do. Again, there is this narcissistic attitude of human beings about what they are capable of. So let's skip the name. My proposal here is, well, let's stick to the name, but let's skip the capital A with Anthropocene and let's just make it a small a, not a capital at all. The interesting thing about the Anthropocene is that it is a cascade of ecological catastrophes. And we need a word to talk about this cascade of ecological catastrophes. So climate change, sea level rise, the disappearance of islands like the Kiribati Islands or Maldives, which will occur just before the end of this century, at least according to the scientists, and many more things. What I want to explore in the 10-12 minutes that I have here is how the Anthropocene changes our conceptualization of nature. The reason for doing this is first that we are talking about the accursed creator, and the accursed creator is doing something with nature. What we have seen before in Jerwin and Agi is related to nature. And when we talk on a large scale effort, then we might argue that Anthropocene is changing nature as well. So I want to bring about 7 points about nature, which are topical these days in discussions about the Anthropocene. And then we can go on and talk about it. First of all, I think that nature is not what it used to be. It is an obvious statement, but it's not. But what I mean with that is that nature is not an object. It is not something out there that we can objectively look at, that we can objectively observe, and so on. Nature is not something over there. It's not an object anymore. And the object is here and the subject is here. That's what we're taught in philosophy or in science even, and the so-called subject-object relationship. But nature is not like that anymore. It doesn't relate to, let's say, normal epistemological understandings anymore. That's one thing that the Anthropocene is doing, and I will try to explain why that might be the case. Nature is very much related to a term that we see over and over again these days, and it's the term of ecology. And ecology is a very difficult concept. The idea of ecology is profoundly systematic. And when we talk about systems, then we should be aware of the fact that a system, if you move something in a system, then all of a sudden anything else that belongs to the system might be moved as well. So if I change something here, then something might change there as well. This is very interesting because in order to cope with these ecological disorders or ecological catastrophes that I talked about, people tend to believe in quick fixes, quick solutions, and so on. Climate engineering, geoengineering, these are the words. So to put in just an example, the Arctic Sea is melting these days. And what are people suggesting that we should be doing? We should prevent water from the Pacific Ocean to enter into the Arctic seas. And how do you do that? By building a dike on the Bering Sea. This is what people have been suggesting these days. And the interesting stuff about these kind of geoengineering solutions is that we probably will solve a certain issue, but we will create a lot of other issues as well. And this is all about ecology. One solution here will create a lot of completely unpredictable effects elsewhere. And that's the meaning of what ecology is all about. In other words, and this is a very important theme in my work, ecologies are completely opaque. That is to say, they are intransparent. So nature is not transparent anymore. If nature is ecology, then we should embrace the idea that it is completely opaque. It's the second thing that I want to talk about. Being opaque means also that nature is not nice anymore. As we have seen in previous presentations, what you did see is occasionally very funny, it's loopy, it's weird, and so on, but it's not a beautiful nature anymore, by any means. I don't think that what we saw is beautiful. I think that what we saw is uncanny, it's interesting, and again it's weird, loopy, and so on. So nature is, as the philosopher Timothy Morton argues, these days is dark, it's grim, it's violent, it's toxic, and so on. The best thing about nature is what I encounter. I had my own experiences in nature, especially in the continent of Australia. That is that this part of nature is not nice at all. If you enter into the rainforest over there or into a desert over there, you will encounter a toxic world, a dangerous world. And all of a sudden you think, no, nature is not to appease or aesthetic needs and so on. That's not what nature is anymore. It's a dark ecology in this sense. Nature also relates to us in many ways. That's the fourth point that I want to make. And the conditions of the Anthropocene, nature somehow permeates us. This is what we saw in the previous presentations as well. But I can easily add a lot of other stuff to it. The more we try to tinker with nature, the more we try to control it, the more we try to appease it, domesticate it, or whatsoever, the more we run the risk that nature will somehow strike back. I especially want to refer here to the problem of what people generally refer to as zoonosis. That is, illnesses, sicknesses that are being transferred from animals to human beings. Ebola virus and so on. And this is a big problem. So, under the conditions of Anthropocene, nature is not a passive factor anymore. And this is the fifth point that I want to make. Nature strikes back. That is to say, nature has an agency. And arguing that nature is completely passive, as we used to do for all of the history of philosophy, history of science. Think, for example, of René Descartes, who argued in the 17th century that the animal is just an automaton, nothing else, just a machine, and without any agency. This seems to be completely wrong-headed. Nature, not just the animal over there, or the ant, or the insect, or the lizard, or the or the frog, has agency, but nature as such has agency. It becomes a factor under the conditions of these Anthropocene. This is a point that is made by a lot of philosophers. One of them being Michel Serres, who happens to be my personal hero, French philosopher. So nature, one might argue, and this is my sixth point, nature is not sovereign anymore. It's neither sovereign as people used to believe. Somewhere out there, I once wrote a rather bulky book on water, and especially on the seas, and the sea was always considered to be completely sovereign. It's a place where we human beings should not be. It's the place of the deities, the gods, and so on. A very dangerous place, a monstrous place as well. So a place with its own sovereignty. This is also lurking in the background of ancient ideas like the sea is sovereign, the sea is free, think of the mare liberum, and so on. These days the sea is not free anymore. It's rather not a mare liberum, it is a mare restrictum, a restricted sea, that is to say not sovereign at all, but also vulnerable. So this is a paradoxical thing. On the one hand, I claim that nature has an agency, has a force towards us. It can permeate us. It can indeed hurt us, and in many ways. But on the other hand, we also notice that this nature is not sovereign anymore, and that's a very, very vulnerable thing. These are 6 points that I've made. It is not what it used to be. It is an ecology rather than nature. It is therefore, it is opaque. It is dark. It is grim. It relates to us in ways that we cannot exactly foretell. It relates to us in a way that seems to be uncanny, loopy. These are the words that we might use. It is also over there still, but it's also in our vicinity. It's on a distance, and yet it's very close. And finally, it has, as I argued, an agency. And now, the interesting thing is, and this is my 7th point, what do we think about the relationship between nature and life? And when we talk about nature and life, again, under the conditions of the Anthropocene, we don't think anymore that nature equals life. And what we see these days in sciences, in biology and so on, biology used to be the science of life, is that we, of these biologists, are more and more interested in the anorganic, that is to say, the non-living parts of nature. I think here, for example, of people like Jane Bennett, an American philosopher, who wrote a wonderful book called Vibrant Matter. It are the unlively things, the things that are not alive, the things that are anorganic, that ultimately build up nature. So my point here is that under these conditions of the Anthropocene, we need to phrase a new concept of nature. Perhaps we should, as Morton or Harman or other philosophers suggest, give up the idea of nature, to jettison the entire concept. That might be done. It's interesting to do that. What I think is a very promising branch of new thought is to think nature ultimately composed of anorganic matter. Or, to quote the Italian philosopher Mario Pagnola, we should perhaps discover the sex appeal of the anorganic under conditions of the Anthropocene. Thanks.
Thank you. If I could welcome our speakers back onto the stage, Renee, Aggie and Jerome. And also Tobias, obviously. He's important sometimes.
Flush with microphones. Right. microphones everywhere. Yeah, let's do that. Have one of those. Can't take it home. So thank you very much, all of you, for speaking. It was really fascinating. I think all the talk shows a sort of different side and a different interpretation of this field and pose some interesting points for discussion. Straight away, Renee, after your talk, I wanted to bring up something you said, which was, I thought, quite provocative, which is this idea that nature is no longer beautiful. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, was it ever really beautiful? There was perhaps a period where it was romanticised, but in certainly my understanding of how nature's been aestheticized and represented, it's always been a thing of fear, a thing for man to demonstrate superiority over, something that was threatening. You referred to the sea as a place of monsters, but also thinking about fairy tales where the forest is where all the monsters live and things like that. Apart from the Romantic period, which paradoxically was the same period that many of the experiments that Aggie was referencing were happening, was there really a period where we thought of nature as anything else but a threat?
I think, does it work?
Try that one out.
I have a loud voice. But anyway, you are right in the sense that the Romantic period extols nature to some extent. To quite an extent, actually. But nature has always been, especially in the Christian tradition, as we're talking about creators, it has been something that was created by God, His Almighty, and therefore it should not be contested, or it should not be criticized. So nature as, let's say, the kind of sign that God imposed Himself on Mother Earth is something that we should very much appreciate. It is only, I think, and this romantic attitude, or this, let's say, religious attitude towards nature is still very much out there. I refer, for example, to debates about windmills that we create here. Windmills are probably necessary in order to get a transition done to new forms of energy. It's very interesting, but people oppose windmills simply because they spoil their view on the world. So I still think that this idea that nature is there and that it's something aesthetic to be enjoyed is still very much popular.
And I think also you allude quite a bit to the idea of the naturalistic fallacy.
Yeah.
That somehow man is separate from nature, and nature is something beautiful that we've, going back to the Adam and Eve myth, have fallen from.
Yeah.
And you can see this every day in things like shampoos that claim to be natural.
Yeah.
But then the counter theory is that actually anything that humans do is natural, if you frame nature as the entirety of everything as you could do.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. But this merely shows the point that I want to make, that nature is somehow in merchandising, advertising, and so on. Nature is always very good. Nature is used as a marketing trick, a marketing trick that is supposed to coax people into purchasing stuff that they otherwise want to purchase. And that's I think a very interesting idea. You know, the other day I met a brewery. They brew beer, and they argued that this beer was the most natural beer in the world. I don't drink beer, but I'm thinking about how can beer be natural. That's very interesting. So. Given the fact that they have their own ways of producing it, and there's a lot of arty-farty stuff going on here, but nevertheless they refer to it as natural. And this also shows how popular the word nature still is. So I'm interested in these philosophies these days, or also these biology of ecologies and so on, who will try to contest this idea that nature is just a token of sheer beauty.
So again, my kind of question for all of you is the idea of, without using the overly used term disruption, but I guess it's the best way to talk about it, you all talk about the disruption and corruption of particular systems. So, but what the interesting thing I kind of find about all of that is that once you've changed them forever. And what happens when how do you mitigate or understand the change that is made, not by the result of a process, but by the catalyst of that process? Or like what happens when you change, or you start to make people think or change about things? We were actually talking about this very lightly earlier. It's like what happens when you do point out this particular difference? What happens when you find that change or you force that change? How do you figure out, or can you figure out the points of harm that might come? What are the various points at which you have to start thinking, okay, I've started this process. Obviously, this is kind of the whole history of scientific progress, right? Is that you change something because you want to know more about something. But how do you kind of account for all of those subsequent and potential changes that might happen in the future?
Does it work? Yeah. I'm not sure if you can. I think it's almost impossible to have a clear vision on what should or could happen when we disrupt something or when we start something new, or we can have opinions and we can have visions on how we would like to see a technology used or disruption used, but the wisdom of the crowd is, I think, still maybe smarter than the one who invents it. So I think it becomes very difficult to get a grasp on your invention or your disruption.
Maybe just to add as well, I think this is obviously just on looking at science, but I think there's a lot of pressure. We were talking about earlier, even really briefly, to produce results, and there's very little time. This is just from my working with scientists. There's very little time for reflection, and I think that's quite important. And it doesn't seem to. I think in a way that's where things like transdisciplinary collaboration could be quite helpful, when you have time to sort of discuss shared concerns and you can actually reflect on what you're doing, what the purpose is, rather than just getting information out that can sort of tick boxes.
I don't know.
Is it you? Obviously, the rate of change of things, the systems that you're working with in particular, is looking at the fact that you've got the very slow process of science, as in like the difference between sort of results and constantly ratifying something, and then the work that speculative designers or artists do to almost kind of push that provocation forward almost in some way. It's kind of that weird juxtaposition of at which point you have to level, or at which point do you have to kind of come to agreement about, I don't know, what you can do or how far you can go, but, or if you can at all.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the thing. I mean, yeah, just to give a little bit of context, I'm working within a transdisciplinary group that's sort of mixed with artists and scientists, and we spend most of the time watching each other. And those are a lot of the observations that come out. We're sort of going like, oh, things happen really slowly in science, and then they're going, but you think too much in art. And there's this kind of like funny conversation that goes on, like to do with that. And I think, in a way, those I suppose like the nuances, or that, yeah, I keep saying like the habits that you form through disciplines can really affect how the research is formulated. Maybe that's, I don't know whether I'm answering what you were saying, but I'm just, yeah.
I think also this ties into something I wanted to ask you two, which was the increasing prominence of artists as scientific communicators, which is not by any way a new thing. Leonardo da Vinci was doing similar things, but it seems to be something that's come around again, where artists are increasingly embedded in academic or corporate contexts, in residence or in collaboration with scientists, and become the aesthetic and the material output of those sciences. They become very visible in popular press, in the internet, in the design world. And in fact, we were talking before about a couple of projects where this has gone drastically wrong, right? And things that were purely speculative have been misread. What does it mean to you as artists working with technologies that are very real, but also very untested, not necessarily living in the world properly yet, not assimilated? How does that change how you think about the way you work with that material as an artist?
For me, first off, I don't see myself as a scientist. I am an artist, and I'm not even sure if I work together with scientists. I can say I might use scientists for my artwork. But I think it's becoming more and more important for artists to go past to go past visualizing your thoughts and your ideas. I think it's becoming more important to make work that actually leaves a scar or leaves something in our place. And a lot of the times you have to work together with different people to create that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you just said, leaving a scar, is like a really good way of putting it, because I think in a way most of the time it's frustrating thinking that you might just be communicating science or someone else's idea, but the idea that you might leave a cognitive imprint that might affect future ideation is like a nice way of thinking about it. So you're not just...
But then personally, in terms of your own practice, you know, your project had a very real effect in that it was going to be monetized. You know, so the value of what you were doing was going to be given to you in old cold hard cash, which is quite nice. But you know, that was a good thing. But there's obviously a lot of different type of ethical dilemmas to deal with, and a lot of different type of conversations to have with the people you're working with. And if you were, for instance, doing a piece of interactive art for a corporation, for their lobby or something. So how do you navigate those types of circles with your own vocabulary as an artist? You know, you've got an idea of how you think and how you want to work through an idea, and they've got an idea of what they think and what they want out of it.
We both looked at each other and were like, please answer this.
Well, with my DNA work, there was not a lot of problems working together with the scientists, because they were quite happy to work together with me in order to create this project. More precisely because they often feel that when DNA data is in the news, in the media, it's often a very negative view on DNA data. That it's it's like this, how do you say it, glass ball. It's this future vision which holds all your information, and exactly, it can show everything about your future life and so on and so on. And so they were quite happy that they could work together with me and create and show a work where DNA data and the use of DNA data and the possibilities, but also the things that you cannot do with DNA data, become more clearer and more nuanced maybe. So in that sense, it was a very good collaboration, and yeah.
Should we throw questions out to the floor? Oh no, brilliant.
I'm always very enthused when artists are interfering in scientific debate, and I've been endorsing this for all my career. There is an old idea, what should philosophers do? Philosophers produce concepts, they don't do anything else. Concepts that allow us to come to grips a little bit with what's going on. And what do scientists do? And they produce percepts, not concepts, but percepts. And they observe things, they notice things, and so on. And what produce and what is the production of artists? Scarce. You both argue. Well, I think that what is so valuable about the contribution of artists in the debate is that they produce probably not scarce, that's too literal or too visual, but effects. And they create effects about all that's going on. Now, this distinction between effects, concepts, and percepts, and that's a well-known distinction in philosophy of art and so on. But I think the problems or the areas of interest that we are dealing with deserve such a very integrated approach. So I'm not only working with artists like you, but I've been working with poets, for example, as well. And I would like to refer, it's just downloadable on the internet. There's a fantastic book on the Anthropocene, it's called The Art of the Anthropocene, published by Open Humanities Press. Just downloadable for everybody here. Just go there and you see exactly what I'm hinting at. Fantastic book.
I've got one last question before we open it up to the audience, which I think hopefully involves all of you to a degree. Rennie, you referred to ecology as a system science, and I think I'm right in saying that it kind of finds its root with computer science and the beginning of trying to model complex systems, and ecologies and weather systems were picked out. And then, of course, you're talking about the idea of DNA as data. Does that somehow make it valuable once it's turned into data? You know, we live in a world, well, we live in a human-constructed world which is obsessed with datafying things to give them value. And then, Aggie, you're looking at the body in a way as a site for learning and a site for knowledge. Is this constant, are we able to properly jettison our relationship with nature as you suggested, or at least the idea of nature, if we're constantly still in this battle across all fields to make it legible? Do we have to give up, as you said it was opaque, it may be illegible forever?
Question for me or for...
Well,
For all of time.
First of all, just one point I like to make, not first of all, it's just my point. We should be very much aware that this very concept of nature is so related and endemic to our own culture. Other cultures never invented such a concept. Nature is a weird country. I don't know a lot about African philosophies or Chinese philosophies, but what I do know about Chinese philosophy is that they don't have developed a concept of nature. That is a nature that's somewhere else, or that is somewhere not us, and so on. This is typically of modernization and modern thought in European thought, and therefore let's be simply very much aware. This is probably what I'm hinting at when I'm talking about the opaqueness. Let us be very much aware about the silliness of this concept of nature, and indeed jettison it.
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting to think that, I mean, we're still seeing stuff through human eyeballs and listening through human ears, and so it is difficult to completely separate yourself from everything else that's going on. So I suppose that's, in a way, the work that I make is to try and understand. In a way, it's sort of selfish. I'm trying to understand myself as well, and I know that's sort of a criticism in the arts a lot of the time, but.
Is that why you use yourself so much as a model in your work?
Yeah, maybe, or maybe just because I can't afford to pay anymore. but yeah, probably you end up like painting things. You'll look at your skin to know how to colour things, or yeah.
I guess it's a continuation with like how for you to particularly using the material of your body in particular, how did that actually make you potentially close that gap or examine that gap that maybe Rennie was talking about between sort of yourself and nature and yourself as natural, in quotation marks, material?
Well, the funny thing is that the DNA data and the work, I hardly saw it as part of me. I think the one time I got really scared was when the first exhibition started and everything was set up, and I was driving home, and I thought, if I crash now, I will be gone, and the survey cabinet will be there with all my DNA data. But after the point that the project started and the exhibition started, and I decided how I should sell it and what the rules were going to be. Now I hardly think about it. I think it's somewhere in my mind in the chamber called ignorance is bliss. So if nothing happens, it will stay there. So for now, I have no emotional feeling with the data. That's And so purely see it as a work of art. Until the Baker Foundation analyzes my DNA data and shows on the internet that you alone has an 80% chance of getting something. Then I have to deal with it.
Well, yeah, well thank you. We're going to throw questions open to the audience. Do you have any burning questions? Oh, I'm going to give you this microphone. So we were going to try and translate, but I don't want to get it wrong. So,
yeah, I was interested by the point made by René ten Bos, because you talk about how nature is being marketingalized somehow, right? That we kind of try to make money by showing how beautiful nature actually is. And I see where, hopefully I see where your criticism is coming from, but on the other hand, there's this huge need to protect nature, or at least like protect our climate or our environment. And I think another side to, you know, showing a bigger audience by like series of Earth by the BBC, for instance, is to kind of make people care about nature or about the planet or, well, everything we hold dear. So it has another function, right? It's not just marketing and capitalism. And if we show like how frightening nature can be, maybe we lose the feeling that we need to protect it. But I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Oh, I have so many thoughts about this.
You could write a book.
Actually, I did. 8-9 years ago, I published a book called The Animal Genius in Dutch, and it is a reflection on an ancient Greek thought, which says nature loves to hide itself. Nature loves to conceal itself. As soon as you see an animal in nature, you know there's something wrong. The only animals that you can really see are animals who are capable of having an easy escape. Birds, for example. Normally you don't see animals. So the interesting thing about these natural documentaries or these fantastic photographs of nature is always that what you see is always a figment. It's never real. Because if you go into nature, you hardly ever encounter a spectacular scenery. That's the interesting thing. I would like to point out that there is a big difference between the management of African reservation parks, wild parks, and Asian wild parks. Because in Africa, in Serengeti or in Kruger Park, you always see animals. And you see lions, and then all these tourists think, wow, what the fuck, real lions, you know. And but they are being fed. These lions are completely semi-domesticated, which is interesting. In Asia, you hardly ever see an animal. And you don't see tigers, you don't see leopards and so on, because they don't feed them. That's real nature. Nature loves to hide itself. As soon as you bring out nature into the open, and then you know there is some marketization going on. And this is definitely the case because in these reservation parks in Africa they make much more money. And here again you get these loopy things as well, because they make much more money and therefore they are capable of protecting these animals. And so you run into all sorts of weird paradoxes. And for me, that's a bit uncanny, and these paradoxes. And I definitely think that the exposure of nature is a thing that's very interesting for marketing. For example, we have this Royal Dutch Air Force, and they do you remember that a couple of years ago? Perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, they advertised their own flights by not showing airplanes, but by showing flying swarms. Yeah. It just as if an airplane is a swarm. And everybody was thinking, oh, the swans are fantastic animals, so let's book. That's crazy.
They're really mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we see how hard it is to get people to care about the environment or climate change because it's intangible, right? You can touch it, you cannot really feel it from a day-to-day difference. I totally understand like what you're saying, and it's very paradoxical. But how can we make people care about something when we don't know it, when it's dangerous or weird or dark and grimy? Is there a way to get around it somehow?
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I don't reject this kind of exposure because I don't have a solution for these questions. But you always run into these loopy kind of things. It's always paradoxical. People ask me, are you against this or are you against that? I don't think so. We discussed here just before we entered this room, the 5 of us or 6 of us, we discussed the concept of hyperobject. This is a very interesting idea by Timothy Morton. Nature or biodiversity and so on is a hyperobject. It's not something there, but it is something that engulfs us. And we do not know precisely how it permeates us or how we permeate it, and we can't see it anymore. Yet at the same time we know that it produces effects that we cannot predict, that we do not understand exactly. And I personally think that when we talk about nature, we have something to do with hyperobject. And now the interesting thing about hyperobject is, can we criticize our way of dealing with them? For example, can we criticize capitalism? Or can we criticize bureaucracy? Or can we criticize globalization? And the interesting thing, and in a similar vein, can we criticize the way that we marketize nature? And that we use it in order to create this sort of affection towards nature that you are talking about. I think it's very difficult to talk about it. My friend Henk Osterling always argues that we can only be hypocritical, which is not the same as hypocritical, but hypocritical. We always have to use what is wrong in order to criticize it. So if you are, for example, against globalization, you should globalize yourself in order to make your voice heard. If you are against the marketization of nature, you have to marketize nature. That's precisely what I'm doing. I'm going to do a lot of lectures on extinction in the coming years. But at the same time, I understand precisely that these sad stories that I have to tell about Hawaiian crow and about other animals like the animals on my arms and so on, these sad stories are so nice to tell. And this is the sort of paradox that we find ourselves in. And so yes, this is what I mean, hypocritical. You have to use the medium that you want to criticize. And when nature is a medium, or when wild reservation parks are medium as well, this is precisely what we are doing.
Next question.
So, I have a question for any of you about death. So how will biohacking influence our Western conceptualization of death and the barrier that exists or supposedly exists between life and death?
Big question.
Yeah.
I suppose there's a lot of research going on at the moment in terms of like how we define death medically. So when I met the guys at Erasmus, they work in the they are behavioural neuroscientists, but they also do anatomy of neuroscience. So they've got a cadaverous research lab there, and they have some really interesting research regarding when your brain is dead and when your body is dead, and it's really difficult to define. And now what's happening is, because there's a lot of research that proves that there's still activity going on, does that signify life or not? And actually it's become sort of quite a political question as well, because it's what happens is certain people have wanted certain things for their family members, but then it's difficult for the medical institution to tell them whether things are alive or dead. So a really interesting example of this is that they dealt with was that once you have something amputated, it's technically medical waste. And there was someone recently who went through a massive court case in order to gain access to his leg that he had had amputated. And it was really difficult for Erasmus because they had to go through this thing, and it put a lot of their jobs in danger. And in the end, the guy sold his leg on eBay, and it really affected how, because they had sort of supported him in trying to define how this dead material that is technically dead is still belongs to him. And it was just sort of interesting that they sort of fought to define this thing, but really his care for it was sort of quite different. Sorry, I know that's quite anecdotal, but...
Interesting. If I might add to this, I think it's a very interesting question about death. There are two kinds of eschatological sciences these days. Eschatological relating to death or extremes. And one is, of course, the science of aging. So there are a lot of people these days who argue that age, or to be old, is simply a disease. And this disease that can be cured somehow. And we have a lot of small computers that can be implanted in our system, and so sooner or later, and my generation will I will probably pass away in 20 or 25 years if I don't drink too much. But you will probably become 100, and in 2 generations we will probably become 200. So there are many people who think that aging is that death will become sooner or later an obsolete category, which is interesting, like nature, by the way. And and on the other hand, we have these scientists who claim that something like the Anthropocene is going on, and that this Anthropocene is very dangerous. And climatologists, I know these publications in serious geography or climatology journals, who argue that in 30 years from now, life on the surface of this planet will be completely unlivable. So the interesting thing about the science of aging, therefore, is where are we going to become older? And that's the interesting question these days, and they cannot answer this question. So probably we will all follow this this scenario from the script from Interstellar, this movie, that somehow some privileged people elsewhere will move to a place where they can become very, very, very old.
And the funny thing is with the discussion about curing death or curing aging, is that most of the time the discussion is purely technical or purely scientific. So it will be a good thing that we will be able to live 100 years or 200 years. But for me, the most interesting things about what those new discoveries will be, what happens with the people that will live to be 200 years old, and all the social problems or the social shifts in, for example, marriage or the job market or creativity, or it becomes quite a different thing to marry to somebody for 200 years instead of maybe 40 years or 50 years. And the same goes with the job market in other parts of society. Yeah.
I just quickly, another story that I heard from another artist working with synthetic biology, Daisy Ginsberg, who was placed in a lab that was exploring building an artificial cell, and the problem they had was they didn't really know what life was in the first place. So they ran into this thing like in ancient philosophy, the pile problem. They had the materials of the cell, and they would say to her, "Is it alive now?" And she'd go, "I don't know." And then they put electricity in, and they go, "Is it alive now?" And I don't know. And then there's two of them now. Is it alive now? We don't really have the good definition for when is inorganic material or organic material. When does that have genesis and becomes life, which is difficult. And this parallels, of course, the conversation happening in the field of computer science around AI. Like, when does something become alive? And the point that I've often suggested is if a 5-year-old child believes that Siri on her iPhone is alive, then subjectively it is. And it's, if you believe it's alive, then is it not?
And also kind of the transposition of the corporeal body onto sort of the data body, in the way that kind of your body, as it becomes information, not just because from scientific processes, but the way you interact with other technological systems. You have data banks of people essentially living in places that we don't know, which are, well, they're knowable in terms of their data services, but your body kind of exists elsewhere, right? So when you have your sort of body as you see it and you experience and you feel it, you have this kind of other body and these doppelgangers and people who live elsewhere. So all of this stuff that we're kind of talking about when things are alive and when things are dead, it's like where our bodies are and actually what our body becomes. Trying not to kind of push a sort of transhumanist narrative at all, because I think that's quite wildly interesting and potentially destructive to this conversation. But looking at the idea about actually what we understand our body to be as malleable material, as things to be transcripted or transposed or put on servers and that kind of thing, it's quite an interesting conversation. So I don't know how, as a kind of last response, anyone has any questions at all? I think we have, how much time do we have, Nick? None. Who wasn't?
I was wondering about the collaboration between artists and scientists, and how you see yourself as artists or designers are now working with science or inspired by it. Do you have any stories or instances of science being inspired by art or working with or from art?
Yeah, I think there's loads. I mean, I think the thing that I think we often forget is that, like, because often I've been in situations where people have said, like, the general public and then, like, scientists, but also scientists make up the general public, and we have to remember that, like, when they go and see films, it will affect their work, and it's kind of this weird, that there's this weird thing that there's this divide in the first place. But I mean, yeah, there's quite a lot of people who've done research into what has culturally affected science, so imagery, film, but yeah. So I think there are a lot of instances of it, and with working with scientists myself, I think that, yeah, a lot of the time you end up observing each other, but I think at the end of the day, just having those kind of conversations you can influence each other. So I don't know whether you found the same.
No, I don't really have a good answer to the question, I think. Like I said, my collaboration with scientists was quite simple and quite easy. And of course I had a very specific thought I was trying to get across and trying to achieve. So
I think that the feedback loop between popular culture and science has been well proven and well trodden at this stage. A really pertinent example is the film The Day After Tomorrow, which David Kirby writes about in his book Lab Coats in Hollywood, where climate scientists were brought in to consult on the film and test the kind of realism of this global catastrophe that would destroy everything. And then effects of that film going back into the way climate science were funded were actually measurable. People actually started funding things, not directly based, but certainly the way pop culture was influenced by that film and the disaster it kind of portended, started to reshape certainly in some bodies in the US in particular, the way that different sciences around climate were funded. So there's a definite feedback loop that's well proven between those things, I think. One final question I think we've probably got time for, and then it's beer o'clock.
I hope it's short answer then. I don't know if it's already addressed because I was to the toilet for a short moment. But we're talking about artists, scientists, but in everything that's being discussed, there's also another factor, that's companies. There's money to be made. And yeah, I think maybe artists, they test ethics, and scientists, I hope they will use ethics. But maybe if there's money to be made, I don't know. What do you think about the position of companies? Because, well, there's a whole world to be sold.
I already alerted you to the capitalocene, so which is arguing that capital is basically responsible for this cascades of ecological catastrophes. Generally, I think, and I publish some stuff on sustainability, business ethics, and all that, and I know people who do research in it. Generally, I don't believe that big companies are of any use here in what we are discussing here. But there is an increase of medium-sized, small-sized companies who take an interest in what is referred to by and large as green issues. I'm not so sure about this. Your question is basically about the nature of capitalism, and capitalism is a very difficult thing, you know. There is a libidinous structure lurking behind capitalism, in the sense that you are constantly encouraged to purchase what you desire rather than what you need. And as long as the gap between desire and need is so big, then we will have a problem in this system. Is this to say that capitalism should be contested? I'm not sure about that. This is what I mean by this concept of why I use the concept of hyper-object. It's very difficult to be against it, but it's also very difficult to be for it. But we have a problem with capital. And the reason for that is that all these companies want us to purchase as much as possible. Yeah? We have this crazy advertisement here, and I translated, about drinks, about the beer o'clock. My neighbor is, we should drink, and then it says, geniet maar drink met mate. So enjoy, but do it moderately.
Yeah.
Don't drink responsibly. What? Oh.
That's the UK equivalent.
Well,
never tried
get rid of responsibility. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's okay. Announce drinks. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything to say briefly? Because you obviously work with some companies, and
well, for me, an important part was to get an opinion and a perspective from a commercial company. I'm glad I proved them wrong, because I am not wordless. I am. But yeah, I'm not too interested in big companies or in that sort of stuff. But I do think that as an artist, they can be your subject, or they can be your working material if you handle it correctly. But then they are part of your artistic project or your artistic process, and not just to sell your stuff or to sell your concepts.
And who were the agents who funded this event?
This is funded by the FBI.
They're listening now.
No, actually, this was an event that was sponsored with the collaboration of FOTODOK and IMPAKT, of course. So thank you to the FOTODOK guys for putting us up and for helping us out with organising it. Thank you, of course, to the Utrecht Archive for having us here in this wonderful space with all this history around. And thank you to the wonderful audience and to our guests for coming along. We'll see you in October for Quantum Machines at the IMPAKT Festival. And yes, and now to the bar to discuss all these things irresponsibly.
Niet bij de afdeling steken, dus jij zit nu